The sound of metal rattling against metal. The distinct rhythmic hammering of a machine gun cutting through the chaos of battle. 600 rounds per minute, 10 bullets every single second, tearing through the air with mechanical precision. In the mud-soaked forests of France, on blood-stained Pacific islands, and in the frozen mountains of Italy, one weapon became the heartbeat of American firepower. It didn't roar like a cannon, it didn't flash like artillery, but when it spoke, the enemy listened. Or they died. Imagine you're a 19-year-old kid from Iowa, crouched behind sandbags, hands gripping a weapon that weighs 40 pounds and gets so hot it could burn through your gloves. Your squad is pinned down. German machine guns are shredding the trees above your head. Your sergeant is screaming orders you can barely hear over the explosions. And then you pull the trigger. The Browning M1919 roars to life. The barrel jerks, the belt feeds, and suddenly the enemy fire stops. That's the power you held. That's the beast that won the war. If this story already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will leave you speechless. This is the story of the Browning M1919, a weapon so reliable, so devastatingly effective that it served in every theater of World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and conflicts beyond. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't get the Hollywood treatment like the Thompson submachine gun or the M1 Garand. But ask any veteran who carried one, who fed its belts, who heard its song in the heat of battle, and they'll tell you the M1919 was the weapon that kept them alive. Let's go back to 1919. The First World War had just ended. American soldiers returned home with stories of trench warfare, poison gas, and the brutal reality of machine gun nests that could mow down entire battalions in seconds. The U.S. military knew one thing for certain: the next war would be won or lost by firepower. They needed a machine gun that was mobile, reliable, and deadly. Enter John Moses Browning, arguably the greatest firearms designer in American history. The man who gave us the M1911 pistol, the BAR, the .50 caliber machine gun. A genius who understood that in war, simplicity and reliability trumps complexity every time. Browning designed the M1919 as an air-cooled variant of his earlier water-cooled M1917 machine gun. The difference? The M1919 didn't need a bulky water jacket to keep the barrel cool. It used airflow and a heavier barrel instead. This made it lighter, more portable, and perfect for the kind of mobile warfare that would define World War II. Chambered in .30-06 Springfield, the same round used in the M1 Garand rifle, the M1919 could punch through helmets, pierce light armor, and shred wooden structures at ranges exceeding 1,500 yards. It fired from a closed bolt, fed from a cloth or metal belt, and could sustain fire longer than almost any other weapon of its time. But here's the thing about the M1919. It wasn't just a gun. It was a system. A crew of 2 or 3 men operated it. One man fired, another fed the belt, a third carried ammunition, spare barrels, and provided security. They trained together, they fought together, and when the M1919 opened up, it didn't just suppress the enemy, it obliterated their will to fight. Let's jump to June 6, 1944. D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Thousands of young American soldiers storming the beaches of Normandy, facing German machine gun nests, mortar fire, and artillery that turned the sand red with blood. Omaha Beach was a killing field. Men were cut down before they even left their landing crafts. Others drowned under the weight of their gear. The Germans had the high ground, fortified bunkers, and overlapping fields of fire. It should have been a slaughter that stopped the invasion cold. But the Americans didn't stop. They couldn't. And one of the reasons they survived that first brutal hour was the Browning M1919. Mounted on M4 Sherman tanks, on half-tracks, on jeeps, and carried by infantry crews who lugged them through waist-deep water under fire, the M1919 became the suppressive fire that allowed infantry to move. When a German MG-42 opened up from a concrete bunker, an American gunner would set up his M1919, pour belt after belt into that firing slit, and give his squad the seconds they needed to flank, throw grenades, or call in artillery. It wasn't always pretty, it wasn't always clean, but it worked. One story stands out. A young machine gunner from Texas, we'll call him Corporal James Miller, made it off Omaha Beach with his crew. His assistant gunner was hit in the leg. His ammo bearer was killed by shrapnel. But Miller kept that M1919 firing. He moved from position to position, covering retreats, breaking up German counterattacks, and holding a narrow section of the beachhead for nearly 6 hours. His hands were blistered from changing hot barrels. His uniform was soaked in seawater, mud, and blood, some of it his own. But he didn't stop, because when that gun went silent, men died. By the time reinforcements arrived, Miller had gone through over 2,000 rounds. His M1919 was scorched, the paint burned off in places, but it still worked. He was awarded the Silver Star, but he never talked much about what he did. Years later, in an interview, he said something simple. "That gun saved my life more times than I saved anyone else's. You respect a weapon like that." Would you have had the courage to keep firing when everything around you was chaos? When every instinct told you to run? Now let's shift to the Pacific, the island hopping campaign. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Dense jungles, volcanic rock, caves and bunkers where Japanese soldiers fought to the last man. The Pacific Theater was hell in a different form: suffocating heat, disease, fanatical resistance, and terrain that turned every advance into a nightmare. The Japanese had their own machine guns, the Type 92 and Type 96, but they couldn't match the sheer volume of fire and reliability of the M1919. American Marines and Army infantrymen used the M1919 in ways it was never originally designed for. They mounted it on amphibious vehicles for beach assaults. They set it up in defensive perimeters to repel nighttime banzai charges. They carried it into the jungle, where visibility was measured in feet, and every shadow could be an enemy soldier waiting to ambush. The M1919 became the anchor of American defensive positions. When the Japanese launched human wave attacks, screaming, charging with bayonets fixed, it was the M1919 that broke those waves. One Marine Corps sergeant described it this way: "You could hear them coming in the dark, hundreds of them, screaming. You couldn't see more than 10 feet in front of you. But when that Browning started hammering, you knew you had a chance. It didn't jam, it didn't quit. It just kept firing until the barrels glowed red and the bodies piled up." There's a documented account from the Battle of Peleliu, one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. A machine gun team was dug in on a ridge covering a narrow pass. Japanese forces launched a series of attacks trying to break through. For 3 straight days, that team held the line. They went through over 10,000 rounds. They burned out 2 barrels. They lost men to sniper fire and mortar shells. But the M1919 never failed. When the battle was over, that ridge was littered with spent brass casings, a bronze carpet of American resolve. Let me ask you this: could you hold your ground when the enemy outnumbers you 10 to 1? When reinforcements are hours away and ammunition is running low? The M1919 wasn't just a frontline weapon. It was mounted on vehicles, aircraft, and used in every conceivable role. Sherman tanks carried them as coaxial and hull-mounted machine guns. P-38 Lightnings and B-17 Flying Fortresses used them as defensive armament against enemy fighters. PT boats in the Pacific bristled with them for close-range engagements. Jeeps turned into makeshift gun trucks with M1919s mounted on pedestals.
It was everywhere. And that ubiquity meant spare parts, ammunition, and trained operators were always available. In war, logistics win battles, and the M1919 was a logistical dream. But let's talk about the weapon itself, the engineering marvel that made all of this possible. The M1919 operated on a short recoil mechanism. When you fired, the barrel and bolt recoiled together for a short distance before unlocking. The bolt continued rearward, ejecting the spent casing and cocking the firing pin. A return spring drove the bolt forward, stripping a new round from the belt, chambering it, and locking into battery. Then the cycle repeated. 600 times per minute. That's the rhythm of war.
The genius of Browning's design was its simplicity. Fewer moving parts meant fewer things to break. The action was robust enough to handle dirt, sand, mud, and water. Soldiers could field strip it, clean it, and reassemble it in minutes, even in the dark, under fire. The quick-change barrel system meant that when one barrel overheated, you could swap it out in seconds and keep firing. And the belt-fed system meant you weren't limited by magazine capacity. As long as you had ammunition, the M1919 kept shooting. There's a reason this weapon stayed in service for over 50 years. It fought in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Some countries still use variants of it today. That's not just durability, that's legacy. Every 4 minutes of sustained fire, a machine gun crew would change the barrel. You'd hear the gunner yell, "Barrel!" and his assistant would already have the asbestos glove ready. Pop the latch, lift out the smoking barrel, heat waves rippling off the metal. Slide in the fresh one, lock it down, resume fire. The whole process took less than 10 seconds if you were good. And in combat, being good meant staying alive. There are stories of M1919s that fired so much, so continuously, that the ammunition belt started to melt. Stories of guns that were dug out of mud, rinsed off with seawater, and kept firing. Stories of crews that ran out of ammunition and used the gun itself as a bludgeon when the enemy overran their position. This wasn't just a machine gun, it was a force multiplier. It was hope when hope was in short supply. Let's return to Europe. The Battle of the Bulge, December 1944. Hitler's last desperate gamble, a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. American forces were caught off guard, outnumbered, and surrounded in freezing conditions. Towns like Bastogne became symbols of American defiance. And in those snow-covered foxholes, in those frozen forests, the M1919 became the difference between survival and annihilation. One account tells of a battalion that held a crossroads for 5 days against repeated German assaults. Their supplies were cut off. Ammunition was rationed. They were surrounded on 3 sides. But they had 4 M1919s and crews who refused to quit. They fired in short, controlled bursts to conserve ammo. They used the guns to cover withdrawals and counterattacks. They turned that crossroads into a fortress of steel and determination. When relief finally arrived, those 4 guns were the only heavy weapons still operational. Everything else had frozen, jammed, or been destroyed. But the M1919s, still ready, still reliable. Would you trust your life to a machine? Would you bet everything on a weapon designed 3 decades before the war even started? The M1919 wasn't perfect. It was heavy, too heavy for one man to carry effectively in combat. It required a crew and a steady supply of ammunition. It wasn't as fast-firing as the German MG42, which could reach 1,200 rounds per minute. But what the M1919 lacked in raw speed, it made up for in accuracy, reliability, and endurance. It was the tortoise in a race full of hares, and it won. American soldiers learned to love it. They gave their guns nicknames. They painted kill marks on the receivers. They treated them like squad members because, in a way, they were. A functioning machine gun could mean the difference between a successful defense and a massacre.
It was the weapon that turned a desperate situation into a fighting chance. After the war, the M1919 continued to serve. It saw action in Korea, where Chinese human wave attacks tested its endurance once again. It was mounted on helicopters in Vietnam, providing door gunners with devastating firepower. It was used by dozens of allied nations. Even today, you can find the M1919 in museums, private collections, and still in limited military use around the world. Some of these guns are over 80 years old, and they still shoot 600 rounds per minute. That's not just engineering, that's immortality. So why don't we talk about the M1919 the way we talk about other iconic weapons? Why isn't it celebrated like the M1 Garand or the Thompson? Maybe because it did its job so quietly, so consistently, that it became invisible. It was always there, in the background, doing the heavy lifting while other weapons got the glory. But the soldiers who used it, the ones who fed its belts, changed its barrels, and trusted it with their lives, they knew the truth. The M1919 was the backbone of American firepower. And here's the thing that should make every American proud. This weapon was designed, built, and perfected in the United States. It was made in factories from Connecticut to Ohio, assembled by workers who understood that every gun they built would save lives. It was a product of American innovation, American industry, and American resolve. When the world needed defending, this was the weapon that answered the call. Let me leave you with one final story. There's a veteran, a man in his 90s now, who served as a machine gunner in the Pacific. He keeps a photo of his crew on his mantle. 4 men, dirt-covered, exhausted, standing next to their M1919 after a battle on Okinawa. When asked what he remembered most about the war, he didn't talk about fear or death. He talked about that gun. He said, "It never let us down, not once. We fed it, cleaned it, and it kept us alive. I owe my life to that weapon and the men who built it." That's the legacy of the Browning M1919. Not just a machine gun, not just a piece of military hardware, but a symbol of American ingenuity, courage, and the unbreakable will to fight for freedom. It didn't just shoot 600 rounds per minute. That's not just engineering, that's immortality. So why don't we talk about the M1919 the way we talk about other iconic weapons? Why isn't it celebrated like the M1 Garand or the Thompson? Maybe because it did its job so quietly, so consistently, that it became invisible. It was always there, in the background, doing the heavy lifting while other weapons got the glory. But the soldiers who used it, the ones who fed its belts, changed its barrels, and trusted it with their lives, they knew the truth. The M1919 was the backbone of American firepower. And here's the thing that should make every American proud. This weapon was designed, built, and perfected in the United States. It was made in factories from Connecticut to Ohio, assembled by workers who understood that every gun they built would save lives. It was a product of American innovation, American industry, and American resolve. When the world needed defending, this was the weapon that answered the call. Let me leave you with one final story. There's a veteran, a man in his 90s now, who served as a machine gunner in the Pacific. He keeps a photo of his crew on his mantle. 4 men, dirt-covered, exhausted, standing next to their M1919 after a battle on Okinawa. When asked what he remembered most about the war, he didn't talk about fear or death. He talked about that gun. He said, "It never let us down, not once. We fed it, cleaned it, and it kept us alive. I owe my life to that weapon and the men who built it." That's the legacy of the Browning M1919. Not just a machine gun, not just a piece of military hardware, but a symbol of American ingenuity, courage, and the unbreakable will to fight for freedom. It didn't just shoot 600 rounds per minute. It fired hope into the darkest moments of human history. These stories remind us why courage matters and why freedom was never free. Subscribe now and join us again for more untold tales of WW2.